It's day 631 of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. Today is 631, day 631 of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. And we are live. Hey, Mad Mike, how you doing? Good to hear it, Stephen. Hey, Bobby. Nightshade, good to see you. M. Chris Carter, love that name. I was a big X-Files fan. All right, so ladies and gentlemen, today is Thursday, November the 16th, day 631 of Vladimir Putin's war of aggression against the people of Ukraine. And we got a couple of things to talk about, just starting with the hardware losses, the Russian hardware losses. In the last 24 hours, we saw 11 tanks, 17 APVs, and 36 artillery systems. I don't know how this is sustainable. I really don't, boy. 16 of 18 of the drones that were sent against the country last night were downed. 2 got through. One X-59 missile was also shot down. Hey, Vanetta, how you doing tonight? I got that list. I got to take a look at it. I'll take a look at it. Matthew C., how you doing? We do not generally discuss casualties, losses here, because the fog of war makes it nearly impossible to know what's going on, what's really going on. And the Ukrainians are certainly very closed-mouthed about their own losses. And so we definitely have very little good information about casualties on the Ukrainian side. But today we had some independent analysis of casualties in the war come from the British Ministry of Defense. And this was from James Heapy, who is essentially the second in command of the British MOD. He's the Armed Forces Minister for the British. And according to him, the Ukrainian numbers are not far off, that the Russians have lost from the battlefield, KIA and WIA, about 300,000 men since the beginning of the war, which is just an inconceivable number. Only we got an explanation today also of how it is likely happening. And that is through the crypto mobilization of prisoners. At the beginning of the war in February of 2023, or 22, pardon me, it was estimated that there were 420,000 people in Russian jails. In a panel discussion in October, Deputy Minister of Justice for the Russian Federation, Volokov, stated that the prison population was at a record low of 266,000. That means that from the Russian prisons, nearly 160,000 men disappeared in the last year and a half, or nearly 2 years now. Where did they go? Some of them got released, sure. You can be sure of that. Some of them got released. Some of them may have passed of natural circumstances. But the vast majority of them appear to have ended up in Storm Z penal battalions in Ukraine, which this goes to the point of why the Kremlin does not care about casualties. They see these people as disposable. When you look at the face of Vladimir Putin, that is the face of evil. That was bad timing, Cascade. But I do appreciate it. I do appreciate it, pal. I really do. But make no mistake that when we look at the face of Vladimir Putin, we are looking at the face of evil, because nobody can look at what this man has done to his fellow Russians and think that this is a legitimate way to prosecute a war. just pardon me, just throwing men into the meat grinder. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. James Heapy from the British Ministry of Defense, the Armed Services Minister, not only reinforced the reality that the Ukrainians have likely taken over 300,000 men off the battlefield in the last 2 years, but he made the point that that number does not include the mercenary troops. You know, we often hear the number that Russia came into Ukraine with 250,000 men. That is not accurate, because in addition to the 250,000 regular men, there were another 44,000 LPR, DPR troops. On top of that, there were another 50,000 Wagnerites, and that was before the penal brigade started to be organized. The reality is that Putin came into the country with a force of 350,000 and then has supplemented it with a force likely of 160,000 prisoners from the jails and prisons of Russia, and with additional mercenary corps from the Gazprom folks, from the Rosatom folks, etc., etc., etc. We don't know how many there are or were. Something really interesting in the British Ministry of Defense report today, they claim that there are tens of thousands of Russian deserters, especially among these penal groups. If the prisoners who have signed contracts have the chance to disappear into the civilian population, they take it. They're gone. They go. And so there have been tens of thousands of deserters. In addition, according to the British MOD, we've seen 7,117 armored vehicles destroyed, including 2,475 main battle tanks of the Russian Federation, nearly a third of the overall stock. 93 fixed-wing aircraft, 132 helicopters, and 16 naval vessels. Now, these are all confirmed losses, confirmed through geolocated footage or other, physical evidence of the destruction of these vehicles. They go on to say that the losses are likely much higher because of the rigorous standards applied to come up with these numbers. And of course, if we look at if we take a look at the Ukrainian numbers, it's likely they are exaggerated. We don't know by how much. But given that the Ukrainians are on the front line with the first-person view drones and are capturing video evidence of everything that they claim, it is likely that the numbers are much closer to what the Ukrainians claim for lost hardware. What this is costing Russia is beyond comprehension. It's beyond comprehension. And we're going to talk about that too in just a moment. Just a little bit of good news here first. David Cameron, the former Prime Minister for Great Britain, is been appointed as the British Foreign Secretary. As such, he immediately came to Ukraine, which was great to see. And he announced aid to the tune of £18.4 million for humanitarian relief. £10 million to the Red Cross for medical supplies and services, $7 million to the Nonviolent Peace Force, which supports nonprofit organization deliveries to the front line, people like Tony Takeri, who's on here every once in a while, and who I have met here in Kyiv. And $1.4 million to Mercy Corps. And so the British are in it to win it. And in his speech today in Odessa, Foreign Secretary Cameron repeated his and his nation's support for Ukraine for the long haul. Natalia Humeniuk, who is the head of the Joint Press Center for the Operational Command Southern Division of Ukraine, today on a local talk show announced that there are, to the best of the Ukrainian military intelligence's knowledge, a stockpile of 800 missiles of the Onyx and Caliber class in Crimea, waiting for the weather to get cold. Well, we're not entirely certain why they're waiting. Could be that they're waiting for the weather to get colder so that when they hit the energy infrastructure, it'll be more devastating. It could be that they're waiting because they're concerned, because Zelensky has said that if they hit energy infrastructure, the Ukrainians are going to hit them back. And when we look in the last month, or not quite a month, in the last 2.5 weeks or so, we've seen 61 attacks against civilian energy infrastructure in Ukraine. Now, Zelensky said that they would strike back for every one of these attacks. Have they? Well, gosh, Russia is on fire. Its 2 major gunpowder factories both caught fire in the last week, one of them on 2 separate occasions. We saw the military base in Krasnodar go up in smoke yesterday. And then today in Volgorod, the military base, along with huge ammo dumps that are still cooking off even as we speak. There is speculation that among what went up were North Korean shells, because there's a rail hub in Volgorod, there's a rail hub in Krasnodar, both of which receive those shells before they get sent to the front lines. So are these attacks and that we see happening inside of Russia responses to the attacks on energy infrastructure here? Or are they just part of the normal strategic operations of the Ukrainian high command? We don't know. We don't know for sure. But certainly the Russians are taking it on the chin. Now, the other possibility with those 800 missiles that are sitting in Crimea and why they haven't been used, or one of the things that's been suggested, is that they are normally, the Onyx and Caliber cruise missiles are normally fired from ships. And the Black Sea Fleet, as we know, is hiding in Novosibirsk. 16 naval vessels in the Black Sea at minimum have been destroyed. 5 of them missile launching ships of the Corvette class. Now, is it possible that they don't have the ships or can't get to the ships to launch these missiles? That could be the case. Or they're afraid to bring the ships out for fear of losing more ships. However, it is important to recognize that these missiles can also be launched from planes. And so it is believed that these missiles are currently housed, according to Natalia, somewhere where they can be loaded onto planes and used to strike. However, given the fact that the Russians have lost 8 fighter jets in the last 3 weeks, 8 $35 million apiece Su-25s, it could be that the Russians are loath to put their fighter jets at risk for these missions. The winter is coming, and the Russians have 800 missiles. Likely have at least 800 missiles pointing at Ukraine, ready to attack the civilian infrastructure here. Now, I want to have a conversation. This is going to be the main conversation tonight. There's 2 parts to this. The first part, according to international human rights law firm Global Rights Compliance, they are asserting that they have evidence that the Russians pre-planned to weaponize food as a tool of war and starve the Ukrainians out. That in the months leading up to the war in December of 2021, Russian defense contractors began purchasing trucks for the movement of grain. Russia purchased 3 new 170-meter bulk cargo ships for moving grain. Within 5 days of the invasion, farmers in Zaporizhia reported that their farms were being seized. 12,000 tons of grain a day were being stolen at the peak of the theft. 12,000 tons of grain a day were being stolen from Ukraine by the Russians. According to the global rights compliance firm who presented this evidence to the ICC today, this was a highly coordinated level of pre-planning of war crimes to weaponize food and starvation as a method of war. Now, not only do we have evidence to indicate that Russia is using its prison population as disposable instruments of war, but we now have more evidence that Russia planned to starve Ukraine just like the Holodomor all over again. All over again. Now, there's more evidence to that fact in the scientific report that was leaked from the Kremlin, and that said that the plan for Ukraine was to depopulate it, to set it up as a mostly agricultural buffer zone between NATO and Europe and Russia, and to depopulate it. Further to that, we have the evidence of the reports from the earliest part of the war, where we saw the plans, the lists of people who should be executed immediately, including the government in Kyiv, and those political opponents of the Kremlin, then those who should be interred in camps, enemies of the state, including the press, and then those who could be counted on to support the new regime. Lists of these groups of people, or even individuals in many cases. I want to take a minute and think about this. The lists of people and how to dispose of them. How they use the prison population as disposable people. The evidence for a pre-planned effort to starve Ukraine, just like the Holodomor 100 years ago, 90 years ago anyway. And then I want to take a look. So put all that in the back of your head for a second, guys. I know it's hard, right? It's hard to put these obscene notions into your head as if they were an action plan, as if this was how you were going to handle your day. This is how you're going to accomplish your goals on top of the mountains of dead that you are going to create. Insanity of the worst sort. And I want to talk about why the Russians don't quit. Because, you guys come on here and I'm talking all the time about, oh, the Ukrainians hit this and the Ukrainians hit that, and the Ukrainians are winning the deep battle, and the Ukrainians are doing this, right? Why am I so hyped on the Ukrainians? And yet Russia just hangs in there and keeps coming for more. Am I disassociated from reality? What's going on here? And how do we make sense of this? How do we not fall into an echo chamber of just listening to the things we want to hear and make sense of all this. That's the conversation I'd like to have with you now. And we'll start by taking a look at the stated reasons that Russia started this war. And make no mistake, Russia started this war, please. This was a war of choice. So there's that, right? If you don't believe that, you don't belong here because you don't deal in facts. And you got to deal in facts in this life. Now, the first thing that I want to say, in terms of me and why I am so positive in favor of the Ukrainian side, is because if you remember, when this all began, I, like everybody else, shook my head in despair. And I said, well, that's a shame. The Russians are going to be in Kyiv in 3 days. This will be over, and there's just nothing we can do about it. And we're going to have to suck it up. This was never supposed to last this long. The idea that it has is miraculous. The Ukrainians have done the impossible. And they didn't just do the impossible once. They keep doing the impossible over and over and over again. It's amazing to watch. I feel very humbled, very privileged to be here to see it because it's magnificent. The way that they outthink and outfight these guys every single day, or virtually every day, and keep this thing going. And let's not forget, well, we'll come back to that. Hold on for a second. All right, so let's start. So first of all, the big reason why I'm so hot on Ukraine is because they have done so much for so little for so long. They are now capable of doing anything with nothing. I'm completely convinced of that. It's amazing to watch. Then there's this. Let's look at Moscow's stated reasons for this war. Now, you know as well as I do, these reasons are mostly BS. But let's take a look at them for a second, and we'll pretend like they're real for a second, and we'll look at them. What was Moscow's first stated objective? The de-Yazification of Ukraine. Now, this is nonsense. I assure you, I am here. There are no Nazis here, or at least no more than there are in South Florida. Actually, probably less than in South Florida. So what they really meant by that was they wanted to install a regime that was friendly to the corrupt systems in Moscow. That's what they really wanted, right? But let's just go with what they're saying. They wanted to push NATO back, right? Clearly, they wanted to push NATO back. That was a real thing. They wanted to support the Russian speakers and end the genocide against the Russian speakers. We'll come back to that in a second. And then they wanted to demilitarize Ukraine. Okay. Where have they gotten in these goals? Well, they certainly didn't install a friendly regime. In fact, they have driven Ukraine into the arms of the West more than if they'd left it alone, right? In terms of reducing NATO borders spaces, it's been increased by 850 miles, right? The entire Finnish border is now NATO. Failure, absolute failure. This idea of a genocide against Russian speakers or bombing Russian speakers in the Donbass, ladies and gentlemen, and everybody else, I assure you, I speak every day to Russian speakers, native Russian speakers from the Donbass who fled the Russian invasion and think of themselves as Ukrainian. And some of them had to take Ukrainian lessons in the last 2 years because they only ever spoke Russian. And they assure me that this is a nation where people speak Russian and Ukrainian, and nobody has ever attacked Russian speakers, or there's never been any campaigns against Russian speakers. It's nonsense propaganda of the worst sort. It's not a real thing. But the practical impact of the war has been that these native Russian speakers who would have gone their whole lives speaking Russian now almost exclusively speak Ukrainian because they think of themselves as Ukrainian. They live in Ukraine. And in the face of this naked Russian aggression, they do not want to be associated with the enemy. And so I swear to God, this whole war is like Putin is glue and the Ukrainians are rubber. And everything he says bounces off of them and sticks to him. Everything has the opposite effect. Finally, there's the demilitarization issue. And this is where Russia is really, the irony of this is palpable. The number of cargo flights out of Kaliningrad has increased by sixfold in the last 2 weeks. The Russians are stripping air defense systems, equipment, ammunition, weaponry, everything that they can get their hands on out of the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad and trying to get it to the front. The Russians did the same thing in Armenia following Nagorno-Karabakh. All of the BTRs, all of the Armenian BTRs, all the weapons caches, ammo stocks that were in Armenia to support the Armenians have been pulled out and put on trains and are headed to the Ukrainian front. The S-300 missile systems that were on the Kuril Islands outside of Japan pulled from there and sent to the Winter Palace and the Summer Palace and Moscow. The missile systems and air defense systems along the. What we are seeing when we look every day at hardware losses for the Russians is Russia demilitarizing itself. The exact opposite of what they wanted to accomplish. Now, we're going to talk about why they continue to do this and they don't quit. We will talk about that. That's coming up, but give me a minute. Because those are the bullshit reasons that Russia gave on the surface of everything. Now I want you to think about the legitimate paperwork, the evidence that we have for Russia's desire to depopulate Ukraine, for Russia's desire to eliminate its own prison population here, its population of undesirables and ethnic folks, and Russia's desire to starve the Ukrainians, the pre-planning to starve the Ukrainians out. How badly are we buffering? I see PT is saying we're buffering. Cheyenne? Okay, thank you. We see all of this. Now, from all of this, what can we, and remember, we got Eugene. Remember Eugene Prigozhin's big speech before the Wagner rebellion on why the Russians invaded? We've got the evidence of that as well. Now, if we put all of that evidence together, what were Russia's real unstated reasons for entering Ukraine? First off, I would argue it was for the erasure of the Ukrainian people, culture, and language. They don't believe that Ukraine, their history, the way that Putin wants to tell the history, is that Ukrainians are just the little Russians, right? They're Russians. And so if they can be erased and their history can be pillaged and erased, it's no big deal. And Ukraine gets back into the Russian fold. Now, the rest of us call that genocide, and we stand against it. in terms, how did that go? How did that go for the Russians, for the Kremlin? This war, the crucible of this war has forged a new and strong Ukrainian identity in a way that only the universal suffering of a people can do. There is a sense here of Ukrainian national identity that has never existed before. It is palpable in the dress. I was at a play on Sunday, and in this play, they transitioned from Gorbachev to an independent Ukraine. Can I tell you how the audience roared their applause when Mikhail Gorbachev's picture came down off the wall in that theater? Thunderous applause. There were people who leapt to their feet when that picture came down and Arnold Schwarzenegger went up. I swear to God, that was the set designer's choice, to represent freedom of the East in this new world. It was beautiful. It was beautiful. So the idea of erasing the Ukrainian people, that's a failure. That's a failure. That's never going to happen now. Why else did the Russians come in? Well, Eugene told us. They came in to divide the natural resources of this nation amongst the elite, the so-called oligarchs of Russia. That's what they came in for, natural resources. Did they get them? No, and they're never going to get them. But I'll bet you that one of those resources was food, that the Russians need the food, not just to feed themselves and keep food prices low because they've kept their people so poor, but also as a way to raise money on the international stage. Russia is one of the largest grain exporters in the world. And so I think Russia wants the world to see it as the breadbasket of Europe and the world, not Ukraine. Clearly reducing Ukraine's attraction to the West and NATO involvement, that was a real goal of this operation. Finally, I think it's safe to say Putin has never gotten over the fact that President Obama and Hillary Clinton referred to Russia as a regional player, not a world power, certainly not a superpower, just a regional player. And it's important for Russia to appear strong, to be a world player. It's part of their national psyche. Now, you can laugh at that, or you can laugh that off, or you can say that's not real, that's not important. But for all the Americans here, I would remind you, USA, USA, America, we're number one, right? That's a real thing, your identity. It's a part of your identity. And it is for the Russians too. They see themselves as a crown jewel of world powers. Thank you, Bob West. As a crown jewel of world powers. And they don't want to give that up. They don't want to give that up. And so they have to win here. Now, what winning looks like can change. At this point, they're willing to settle for the land. Lars sent me a link to a report that crunched the numbers from a local opinion poll inside of Russia this week. And I was surprised because the version that was reported on in the press he sent me did not address one of the questions that struck me the most, was that 70% of Russians say they are not in favor of peace talks if it means giving up land. 70%. Hold on. 70% of Russians are against peace talks if it means giving up land. Why? Because they have to win. They have to have something that looks like a win, or all of this is for naught. All of this was for nothing. Their demilitarization, their empty stockpiles of weapons, the mountains of dead, the graveyards that go on for miles, none of it means anything if they don't win. And that is why they have to lose. That is why they must not be permitted one single inch of ground. If they are rewarded for this behavior in any way, if their identity of strength and power and position in the world is reinforced, they are going to do it again in Moldova, in Transnistria, in Georgia, in wherever. They're going to do it again. Not only that, it'll be a green light to the mullahs in Iran and the Kim regime in North Korea that they too can act this way. And the world will let them get away with it. No, it can't be allowed. This is the line in the sand right here in Ukraine. And today that line is literally being drawn in the sand as the Ukrainians expand their bridgehead on the left bank of the Dnipro into the desert region, the only sand desert in Ukraine, and push the Russians back, meter by meter, kilometer by kilometer. If the Russians can break through in the south, I imagine that the entire southern front line could collapse in a short time. Because the Ukrainians will be able to come at them from behind and the front. And that's where we're at today, guys. Okay. So, ladies and gentlemen, and everybody else, thank you so much for tuning in. Those are my thoughts for today. I'm going to end the YouTube stream, and then we'll take